He slammed both hands flat on the counter of the Silver Creek General Store and stared down the most powerful woman in town until she stepped back. "You raised her rent again," Ethan Walker said, quiet as a blade being drawn. "Do it one more time. Margaret and I will buy that building out from under you before Sunday services are over." Every man in that store went still. Every woman held her breath. Because Ethan Walker had just declared war over a woman, the entire town had already decided didn't matter. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what happened in Silver Creek, Colorado in the winter of 1885 is something I am not going to let you forget. Ethan Walker had not been back to Silver Creek in 14 months. He had not planned to come back at all. The mountains suited him. The silence of them. The predictability of them. The way the cold never apologized for being cold, and the wind never pretended to be anything gentler than what it was. 14 months of trapping in the high Rockies with nothing but a mule, a rifle, and enough dried meat to keep a man honest had given him a fortune in pelts, and something far more valuable, the absolute certainty that he did not need a single thing that a town could offer him. But boots wore out, and a man with bleeding feet could not trap anything. He came down the mountain on a gray Tuesday morning with 400 pounds of premium beaver and fox pelts loaded on 2 mules and a pair of boots so destroyed that his left heel had been dragging bare leather against frozen ground for 3 days. He felt it with every step, a raw grinding ache that had moved past pain and settled into something that simply demanded attention. Not comfort, not sympathy, just repair. Silver Creek appeared below him, the way it always did from that ridge. A cluster of wood and smoke and ambition jammed into a valley that had no business holding that much noise. He paused at the top of the road and looked down at it for a long moment. He had never loved this town. He had grown up 20 miles south of it and spent most of his adult life avoiding it. But his trading contact was here the only man in 3 counties who paid honest weight for prime fur without trying to trim the scale. And somewhere in Silver Creek there was a leather shop, because he remembered seeing one 2 years back on his last pass through, tucked near the eastern edge of town, where the nicer establishments didn't bother to go. He clicked his tongue at the mules and started down. He was aware of the attention the moment he hit the main street. That was the thing about coming down from the mountains. With a full season's take, people noticed. Men on the boardwalk straightened up. A group of boys stopped throwing a feed sack at each other and stared. Ethan kept his eyes ahead and his pace steady, guiding the mules toward Calloway's trading post with the flat expression he wore in every public space, the one that said he was passing through and not available for conversation. He was wrong about the conversation. He had barely finished tying the mules outside Calloway's when he heard her voice. "Ethan Walker, my goodness, look at you." Margaret Hale was already moving toward him from across the street, picking her way through the mud with the careful precision of a woman who owned expensive shoes and intended everyone to know it. She was handsome in the way that wealthy widows in cattle country tended to be handsome, well-dressed, well-rested, constructed with purpose. Her late husband, Douglas Hale, had died 2 years prior and left her his cattle operation, his real estate holdings, and more social leverage than any one person had a right to in a town this size. She had been using all 3 aggressively ever since. "Margaret," Ethan said, "you look like you've been living in a cave." She stopped in front of him and looked him over the way a buyer looks at livestock, not bothering to disguise it. "How long were you up there?" "Long enough." "You must be starving. Come to dinner tonight. I've got a new cook trained in St. Louis and I appreciate the offer," Ethan said. "I've got business to attend to." She smiled like a woman who had not heard the word no. "It's just dinner, Ethan." "It's never just dinner, Margaret." He untied the lead rope and started walking. "Enjoy your afternoon." He felt her watching him all the way to the trading post door. Calloway was a fair man, and the weighing took the better part of an hour. When it was done, Ethan walked out with a significant sum in his coat pocket and the knowledge that the pelts would move fast. The eastern buyers were hungry this season, and Calloway knew it. They shook hands without ceremony. That was the part of Silver Creek Ethan could tolerate. The transactional part. The part where a man brought a thing of value, exchanged it for currency, and moved on with his business. He was heading back toward the mules when the second one found him. Rose Bennett came around the corner of the feed store like she had been waiting there, which Ethan suspected she had. Rose was younger than Margaret by about 10 years and had a different approach, less calculation, more warmth, or at least a convincing imitation of it. Her husband had died of a fever the previous spring and left her with a boarding house that was doing well enough to keep her comfortable and restless at the same time. "I heard you were back," she said, falling into step beside him. "Word travels fast." "It always does when it's about you." She touched his arm, brief and light. "You look exhausted, Ethan. You should let somebody take care of you for once." "I'm fine." "You don't look fine. You look like you've been out in that wilderness alone for too long." Her voice dropped into something softer, more deliberate. "A man like you shouldn't be alone, Ethan." He stopped walking and turned to look at her. Rose held his gaze with the steady confidence of a woman who was accustomed to being found compelling. "Rose," he said, not unkindly, "I know what you're offering, and I know why. And I respect that you've built something good here since Thomas passed. But I am not what you're looking for. And what you're offering is not what I need." She blinked. "You don't even know what I know." He picked up the mule's lead rope. "Take care of yourself." He left her standing in the street. The boots were the problem now. The left one had finally given up entirely, the sole separating from the upper, with every step in a way that was grinding his heel raw and making a sound that attracted notice. He needed to find that leather shop before he did anything else. Before he found lodging, before he ate, before he dealt with any of the other 1,000 things a man accumulated on a trip back to civilization. He asked a boy near the water trough where the leather shop was. The boy thought about it for a moment. "You mean Miss Hannah's place?" "If that's the leather shop on the East End, yes." The boy made a face, not a cruel face exactly, more a dismissive one, the expression of a child who has absorbed the adult attitudes around him without understanding them. "Yeah, that's hers. It ain't much to look at." "I don't need it to look at. I need it to fix boots." The boy shrugged and pointed east. Ethan walked. The shop was at the far end of the commercial street, past the point where the boardwalk ended, and the road went back to packed dirt. The building was small and set slightly back from the street, the kind of place that existed without announcing itself. The sign above the door said, "Cole Leather Works," in painted letters that had been touched up recently, the C and the L noticeably fresher than the rest. The window was clean. The door was closed against the cold, but not locked, and through the glass, he could see the warm amber glow of a working lamp. He pushed the door open. The smell hit him, first leather, and oil, and the faint trace of wood smoke from a small stove in the corner. It was a working smell, an honest smell, the smell of a place where things were made and fixed and made again. After 14 months in the high country, it struck him as almost comfortable. The woman at the workbench did not look up. She was seated on a low stool with a man's boot across her knee, her hands moving with the kind of precision that came from years of repetition. She was heavy, solidly, unmistakably so, with dark hair pulled back without ceremony and a leather apron over a plain gray dress. Her hands were the first thing he really noticed, strong and sure and completely focused on what they were doing. "Be with you in a moment," she said without looking up. Ethan stood in the doorway and waited. He was a patient man by nature and by necessity. 14 months alone in the mountains required patience, the way it required a sharp knife and dry powder. Not as a virtue, but as a condition of survival. So he waited and watched her work and didn't speak. She finished the stitch she was on, set the boot aside with a care that suggested it mattered to her, even though it wasn't hers, and looked up. Her eyes were steady, dark brown level, giving nothing away. She looked at him the way a craftsperson looks at a job, assessing, not performing assessment. "What do you need?" she said. "Boots." He stepped inside and let the door close behind him. "Left sole's pulling away from the upper, and the right heel is down to nothing. I need them rebuilt, not patched." She held out her hand without standing up. A gesture that said, "Give them here." He sat in the wooden chair near the door. the customer's chair placed there for exactly this purpose, and pulled off the left boot first. She took it from him and turned it over in her hands, running her thumb along the separated sole, pressing the leather to feel where the integrity had failed. She didn't make any noise about the state of it. She just looked. "How long have you been walking on this?" 3 days. "Through what terrain?" "Rocky ground, ice at elevation, crossed 2 creeks." She nodded slowly, still examining the boot. "You've got good leather here originally. This was built right. It just ran out of time." She set it on the bench and looked at him. "The right one." He pulled off the right boot. She examined it with the same attention. "You want this done right? It's going to take me 2 days." "I can wait." She looked up at that, and for a moment something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more a kind of recalibration, like she had expected an argument or a negotiation and received neither. "Most men can't." "I said I can wait. Do you need half the payment now? I'll take it all when it's done." She stood setting both boots on the bench behind her and reached for a measuring board on the shelf. "I'm going to need to measure your foot if I'm rebuilding the soles properly. They should be fitted to how you actually walk, not to some standard last." "All right." She crossed the room to him, knelt down in front of the chair, and set the measuring board on the floor in front of his left foot. It was a businesslike motion, efficient and unself-conscious, and she moved the way a person moves when they've spent so much time in a place that every inch of it is known to them. She pressed his bare foot to the board and marked the length and width with a pencil, noted the angle of his arch pressed lightly along the outside edge, where the wear pattern showed how his weight distributed. His feet were not in good shape. The left heel was cracked and bleeding in 2 places, the skin rough and abraded from days of contact with deteriorating leather. She paused when she felt it under her fingertips. "When did you last wash these?" "Few days back." She didn't say anything else. She stood, went to the back of the shop, and came back with a shallow basin of water. Not hot, just clean, and a cloth in a small tin that smelled of pine pitch and tallow. She set the basin on the floor in front of him, dipped the cloth in the water, and began to clean the dried blood from his heel. Ethan went very still. It wasn't an unpleasant stillness. It was the stillness of a man who has been surprised by something he cannot immediately categorize. She worked with the same quiet precision she had brought to the boots. No fuss, no commentary, no performance of concern. She cleaned the wound, dried it carefully, and applied the salve from the tin with 2 deliberate passes of her thumb. Nobody had done that for him in a very long time. He couldn't remember actually the last time someone had. "You don't have to," he started. "Infected heel means you can't break in the rebuilt boots properly," she said without looking up, "which means my work doesn't hold the way it should. I take the condition of the foot as seriously as the condition of the leather." She moved to the right foot and repeated the process. "Does that hurt?" "No." "It should. You've got some raw spots." She glanced up at him briefly, then back down. "You must have a high tolerance." "Mountain trapping. You learn. I expect you do." She finished and sat back, setting the cloth aside. "I'll have the left boot ready for a fitting tomorrow afternoon and the right one the morning after." "Where are you staying?" "Haven't figured that out yet." "The Garrett boarding house on 2nd Street. Clara Garrett runs it and she doesn't tolerate nonsense. You'll sleep and you won't be bothered." A pause. "Tell her Hannah Cole sent you. She'll give you a fair rate." He looked at her for a moment. "You know her well. She's my neighbor's cousin." She stood and moved back behind the workbench. "If you need to check in on the progress, come by in the afternoon. I'll be here." It was a dismissal, not a rude one, just the natural end of the transaction. She had taken his information, assessed the job, given him a timeline, and was now returning to the work that had been waiting. He pulled on his socks, bare feet on the cold floor for a moment and stood. "Miss Cole," he said. She looked up. "Thank you. For the—" He gestured vaguely at the basin on the floor. "It needed doing," she said, and looked back down at her work. He walked out into the cold Silver Creek afternoon and stood on the dirt street for a moment, with both ruined boots in his hand, and his socks getting damp. and the strangest sensation moving through his chest. Something he had not felt in so long that it took him a full 30 seconds to identify it. Quiet. He felt quiet. Not the quiet of the mountains, which was vast and impersonal and asked nothing of him. A different kind. The kind that came from being in the presence of another person who was not performing anything, not wanting anything, not calculating anything. Just working. Just present. Just still. He had been in Silver Creek for less than 3 hours. He walked to the Garrett boarding house in his socks. He did not see the two women watching from across the street. Margaret Hale, standing in the shadow of the millinery, and Rose Bennett beside her, both of them watching him walk away from Cole Leather Works, with expressions that had moved well past surprise into something harder and more deliberate. "He went to her shop," Rose said, as if she still couldn't quite process the information. "He walked out of there without his boots," Margaret said. "And he looked—" She paused. The word she was looking for was peaceful, but she wasn't willing to say it out loud. "He didn't look like himself." "She's nobody," Rose said. "She's just the fat leather woman on the East End. She doesn't have to be somebody," Margaret said, "for him to become interested in her." Her voice had gone flat and precise, the voice she used when she was done feeling a thing and had started planning around it. "Which means we may have a problem." She turned and walked back toward her office, and Rose, after one more look at the empty doorway of Cole Leather Works, followed. Inside the shop, Hannah Cole bent her head over Ethan Walker's destroyed left boot, turned it in the lamplight, and began to work. She did not think about the man who had just walked out the door. She did not think about his scarred hands, or the way he had gone perfectly still when she cleaned his feet, or the fact that he had thanked her genuinely, thanked her for something every other customer either ignored or seemed to feel entitled to. She did not think about any of that. She thought about the leather, about where the separation had begun, and what the stress pattern said about how this man moved through the world. She thought about the sole she would cut for him, and the wax she would use on the stitching, and the way the heel needed to be built up by perhaps a 1/4 inch on the left side to account for the slight unevenness in his gait that she had noted when he walked in. Her hands did not shake. Her mind did not wander. She worked as she always worked, in complete silence, in complete focus, in the shop she had built from nothing, in a town that had never once looked at her and seen anything worth seeing. She worked, and the lamp burned steady, and outside on the main street of Silver Creek, the evening was starting, and the noise of ordinary life was rising, and none of it touched her. Not yet. Ethan came back the next afternoon the way he said he would. No fanfare, no announcement, just the sound of boots on the dirt street, and then the door of Cole Leather Works opening at exactly the hour Hannah had expected him. She had the left boot ready. He sat in the customer chair, and she knelt with the boot in her hands and fitted it onto his foot with the focused attention of a surgeon pressing along the sole to check the contact, watching his face for any sign of discomfort, without asking him to perform the discomfort out loud. He didn't. He sat still and let her work, and didn't fill the silence with anything unnecessary. "Walk to the door and back," she said. He did. She watched his gait, the way she had watched it the first time, tracking the small adjustments his body made, the way his weight shifted, where the boot gave and where it held. He came back and stood in front of her. "Well," he said, "1/4 inch on the left heel is right. How does the arch feel? Better than it's felt in 2 years." She nodded once, took the boot back, made 2 marks with her pencil. "Right one will be done by morning. Come by before 8 if you want it, before the day gets going." "I'll be here." He didn't leave. She noticed it the way she noticed everything in her shop, peripherally and precisely. He stood near the door with his hat in his hand, and she went back to the workbench and picked up the right boot and waited for him to say whatever it was he was still carrying. "How long have you had this shop?" he said finally. 6 years. "You built it yourself?" "Bought the space with savings from working at a saddle operation in Pueblo. Rebuilt the interior myself." She ran the awl along the welt line without looking up. "Why?" "Just thinking." A pause. "The sign out front looks newer than the building. I repaint it when it starts to fade." Another pause. She heard him shift his weight. "Is there something you need, Mr. Walker, besides the boots?" "Ethan," he said. She glanced up at that. He was looking at her with an expression that was neither flirtatious nor transactional, just direct, the way a man looks at another man when he wants to drop the formality and talk straight. "Hannah," she said, and went back to the boot. He stayed another 20 minutes, mostly quiet, occasionally asking questions about the leather she was working with, about the sourcing of good hide in that part of Colorado, about whether the military contracts were reliable. She answered him honestly and completely, without embellishment, and without the habit she had developed over years of making herself smaller in conversation, so that people wouldn't feel threatened by the fact that she knew what she was talking about. She just answered. When he left the shop, felt a size larger than it had before. She sat with that for a moment, then pressed it down and kept working. She did not see Rose Bennett watching from across the street through the millinery window. She did not see Rose turn and walk straight to Margaret Hale's office on Main Street. She did not hear the conversation that followed, but she would feel its consequences before the week was out. Margaret Hale's office was the kind of room that told you everything about the woman who occupied it. Ordered expensive, chosen with care, and arranged for maximum effect. She was behind the desk when Rose came in, going over a ledger, with the concentration of a woman who understood that money was power and that power required maintenance. "He went back," Rose said without sitting down. Margaret did not look up from the ledger. "I know. He stayed for half an hour. They were talking. I know that too." Margaret turned a page. "Sit down, Rose, you're making me tired." Rose sat. "What are we going to do?" "We." Margaret closed the ledger and looked at her. "I'm going to handle this. You are going to stay calm and not do anything impulsive that I'll have to clean up later." She folded her hands on the desk. "Hannah Cole's lease on that shop is through my family's property holdings. My late husband bought 3 buildings on the East End in 1879 and never bothered to sell them because they weren't worth the trouble." A pause. "They may be worth something now." Rose stared at her. "You're going to raise her rent." "I'm going to reconsider the current rate, which has been significantly below market value." Margaret's voice was perfectly level. "That is not cruelty, Rose. That is business. She can't afford—" "That's not my concern." Margaret opened the ledger again. "Close the door on your way out." Hannah found the letter slipped under the door of the shop the following morning before Ethan arrived to collect the right boot. She read it twice, standing in her apron with the lamp still warming the room, and the number on the paper was so far above what she currently paid that her first thought was that it was a mistake, a clerical error, some confusion in the property records. Her second thought was that it was not a mistake at all. She set the letter on the workbench, picked up the right boot, and kept working. Ethan arrived at 10 minutes to 8, as she had expected. She handed him the boot without ceremony. He fitted it on, walked the same path she had asked him to walk the day before, came back, and the look on his face told her everything she needed to know about the work. "That's the best boot I've ever worn," he said. It wasn't a compliment designed to please her. It was a statement of fact from a man who spent his life in boots and knew the difference. "The arch support on the right will take a few days to break in fully. Don't push through it if it starts to bite." "All right." He reached into his coat for the payment. She named the price, and he counted it out without argument and set it on the counter. Then he looked at her. She had her back to him, returning the tools to their proper places, and she was aware of that look the way you're aware of weather changing. "You all right?" he said. "Fine." "You don't look fine." She turned around. The letter was on the workbench between them, and she saw his eyes go to it, then back to her face. "Property trouble," she said, because it was the truth and she wasn't going to lie about it. He waited. "My landlord is raising the rent, significantly." She kept her voice flat and factual. "I have 30 days to either pay the new rate or vacate the space." "Who's your landlord?" She held his gaze. "Margaret Hale." The air in the room changed. She watched it happen, watched something shift behind his eyes. Something that had been patient and quiet harden into something else. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't say anything at all for a long moment. He just looked at the letter and then at Hannah, and then back at the letter, and she could see him thinking, could see the calculation running behind that still expression. "Is the new rate something you can manage?" he said. No. He picked up the letter. She let him read it. He set it back on the bench and straightened up and pulled his hat on. "This isn't about rent," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her for one more beat, the same assessing look he'd given her ruined boots, the look of a man measuring a problem against his capacity to address it. Then he turned and walked out the door. She stood at the workbench and breathed and did not let herself hope for anything in either direction. She had been running her own calculations since finding that letter, and the numbers were not good. The new rate was nearly 3 times what she currently paid. She had savings. 6 years of careful management had given her more than most people in this town suspected, but not enough to sustain that increase indefinitely, not while also maintaining inventory and paying the army contract supplier who came through every 2 months. She could find another space theoretically, but the East End was the only part of town where her rent had ever been manageable, and the rest of the commercial district was owned by the same small circle of people who had made it quietly, consistently clear over 6 years that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. She knew what this was. She had always known that Margaret Hale owned those buildings on the East End, the same way she knew most things about the financial architecture of Silver Creek quietly and completely, because information was the only currency she had ever been able to acquire freely. She had never given Margaret Hale a reason to notice her. She had never given anyone in this town a reason to notice her, until apparently now. She picked up a piece of uncut hide and began to work, because that was the only answer she had ever found to anything. She didn't see Ethan walk straight to Margaret Hale's office on Main Street. She didn't hear him open that door without knocking, which made Margaret look up from her desk with the sharp expression she used to remind people that she was not someone whose time was taken without permission. The expression didn't last long. Not under the way Ethan Walker was looking at her. "I heard you've reconsidered the lease rate on the East End," he said. Margaret set her pen down with deliberate calm. "Property values change. That's the nature of real estate. Triple the current rate in 30 days. That's not market adjustment, Margaret. You know that as well as I do." "I know what my holdings are worth." She leaned back in her chair. "And I know what I choose to do with them. Neither of those things is your concern." "I'm making it my concern." She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back, and the thing about Ethan Walker, the thing that had made men back down from him in saloons and trading posts and on mountain trails, where backing down was not something men generally did, was that he never needed to raise his voice to make the weight of his position felt. He stood in that office with his hat on and his arms at his sides and said nothing else, and the silence did more work than a speech would have. "You've known that woman for 2 days," Margaret said, and there was an edge under the composure now. "2 days, Ethan. Long enough to know the difference between a business decision and a punishment." Her jaw tightened. "I don't know what you think is happening here. I think a woman who works harder than anyone else on your street is being targeted because I went to her shop instead of your dinner table." He said it without heat, without cruelty, just fact. "And I think you're smarter than this, Margaret. So I'm going to ask you one time straight, reconsider the notice." She stood up. She was tall for a woman, and she drew herself up to full height now the way she did when she was reminding the room that she had survived the death of a powerful man and built something stronger in the wake of it. "Don't come into my office and tell me how to manage my assets. I'm not telling you anything. I'm asking." He pulled the door open. "Think about it." He left. She stood behind her desk with her hands flat on the surface and stared at the closed door and felt something she had not felt in a long time, the specific discomfort of a plan encountering genuine resistance. She had expected Hannah Cole to fold. She had expected the letter to accomplish what it was designed to accomplish quietly and without drama, the way these things always worked when you held the property and the other person held nothing. She had not expected Ethan Walker. She sat back down and thought carefully, and the conclusion she arrived at was not retreat. Margaret Hale did not retreat. She regrouped. By the end of the day, she had sent a second letter. Not to Hannah, to the Army Supply Depot that processed the leather contracts in the territory. A carefully worded note to a man she had done business with through her husband's estate, suggesting that there were some questions worth asking about the quality and origin of the leatherwork coming out of Cole Leather Works in Silver Creek. She knew how these things worked. You didn't fight a battle at the front, you cut the supply line. Hannah found out about the second letter 4 days later, when Corporal James Tate rode into town from the depot and knocked on the door of her shop, with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally apologetic. "Miss Cole," he said, "I've been asked to come by and discuss some concerns that have been raised with the depot regarding your contract." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of concerns?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Questions about consistency of materials, durability claims." He paused. The letter was specific. Someone with access to information about your operation put it in front of the contract officer. She felt the cold move through her chest. Not fear. Something more clarifying than fear. Who signed the letter? It came through a proxy, but it was presented on stationery associated with Hale family business interests. He met her eyes. "I'm sorry, Miss Cole. I wanted to tell you in person because your work has been exemplary. Every inspection we've run has confirmed it. But until the contract officer reviews the complaint formally, your next delivery may be held." He left her standing in the doorway of her shop, with the afternoon light behind her and the sound of Silver Creek going about its business in front of her, and the absolute certainty clear as ice water that this was no longer about rent. This was about erasure. She closed the door. She stood in the quiet of her shop and looked at her workbench and her tools, and the current order laid out in organized sections, 12 sets of cavalry boots half-finished 3 weeks from delivery. She had built this contract over 4 years of reliable work and 0 complaints. She had built this shop from nothing. She had built her savings from nothing. And someone who had never spent a day working with her hands was now trying to dismantle all of it from behind a desk. She picked up her awl. She pressed the point of it into the hide in front of her, and she worked because working was the only thing she knew how to do with rage. She worked until the lamp burned low. And when she finally sat back and looked at what her hands had made, it was perfect. It was always perfect. Because Hannah Cole had understood something very early in her life that most people in Silver Creek had never bothered to learn, the only power that no one could take from you was the power that lived in what you could actually do. She knew things about this town's financial structure that would make Margaret Hale's careful social posture collapse like a poorly stitched seam. She had never used that knowledge because she had never needed to. She had never wanted to fight. She had only wanted to work. But that, she thought, setting down the awl and looking at the letter on the bench might be about to change. Ethan found out about the Army contract letter the same way he found out about most things in Silver Creek. Not because people told him, but because people talked around him as though his silence meant he wasn't listening. He had been at Calloway's trading post the morning after Hannah's visit from Corporal Tate, picking up a supply order he'd put in the day before, when he overheard 2 men at the counter discussing it with the casual cruelty of people who considered someone else's misfortune to be entertainment. One of them, a heavy-set man in a merchant's apron, whose name Ethan didn't know, was saying that it was only a matter of time before the coal woman had to close up, that the East End shop had always been a charity case anyway, that a woman like that had no business running a military contract operation. The other man laughed. Ethan set down his supply order and turned around slowly. "You got a name?" he said to the man in the apron. The man blinked. "Excuse me." "A name. Do you have one?" "Briggs. Tom Briggs. I run the—" "Tom Briggs." Ethan said it the way a man says something he wants to remember. "You know Miss Cole personally?" Briggs shifted his weight. The laugh had gone out of the room very quickly. "I don't see what that's got to do with—" "Do you know her personally? Yes or no?" "Well, no, but everyone knows that she—" "Then you don't know anything." Ethan picked his supply order back up. "I'd keep your opinions about things you don't know anything about between you and your mirror Tom. It'll serve you better." He walked out without waiting for a response. He went directly to Hannah's shop. She was working when he came in. She was always working when he came in, and she looked up without surprise, because she had learned in the space of 4 days that Ethan Walker's face told you exactly what was driving him, if you knew how to read it. And right now, it was telling her that he already knew. "You heard," she said. "Calloway's. This morning." He came to the workbench and stood across from her. "Tell me what Tate said exactly," she told him. She did it the way she did most things, directly, without softening or editorializing, just the facts in sequence. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she watched him the way she watched a piece of leather she was about to cut, waiting for the right line to show itself. "She's trying to collapse the contract before the rent fight even plays out," he said. "If the Army holds the next delivery, I lose the operating income that makes the new rent theoretically possible." Hannah set down her tool. "It's efficient, actually. I can respect the strategy even if I can't respect the reason for it." He looked at her. "You're not scared." "I'm furious," she said. "That's different." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "What are you going to do? What I should have done 3 years ago." She reached under the workbench and pulled out a flat wooden box, the kind used for document storage, and set it on the surface between them. "I've been keeping records since I opened this shop. Every transaction, every contract, every supply purchase, every communication, including the communications I wasn't supposed to know about." He looked at the box. "What kind of communications?" "The kind that explains why the property on the East End was never sold after Douglas Hale died." She opened the box and pulled out a folded document, aged and slightly worn at the creases. "Margaret Hale does not legally own the building I'm renting." The room went very quiet. Ethan looked at the document in her hand. "Say that again." "Douglas Hale purchased the East End properties in 1879, using a land arrangement that included a silent co-ownership agreement with a man named Gerald Cole." She held his gaze steadily. "Gerald Cole was my father." Ethan went completely still. "My father died in 1881. He left no will because he didn't believe in them, which was his greatest flaw and the source of most of my problems for the past 6 years." She set the document on the bench. "When Douglas Hale died in 1883, Margaret inherited his holdings. But the co-ownership arrangement on the East End properties was never legally dissolved and never transferred. Under territorial property law, half of those buildings still belongs to my father's estate." A pause. "Which means it belongs to me." He looked at the document, then at her. "Does Margaret know this?" "She knows her husband had some kind of arrangement on the East End. I don't think she knows the details. Douglas Hale ran his business affairs separately from his personal life, and Margaret was not a woman who asked questions about paperwork she didn't consider her domain." Hannah folded her hands on the workbench. "I found this document in my father's effects when I came to Silver Creek. I've had it verified by a land attorney in Pueblo. It's legitimate." "Then why haven't you—" "Because I didn't want to fight." Her voice was flat and honest. "I came here to work. I found a shop, I built something, I kept my head down and did my job. The arrangement as it stood, me paying rent on a building I half-owned, was something I was willing to absorb in exchange for not having to walk into Margaret Hale's world and make an enemy of the most powerful woman in this county." She paused. "That calculation has changed." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that she hadn't seen before, not pity, which she would have rejected, not admiration exactly, but something in the space between those two things. Recognition, maybe. The look of a person who has spent a long time doing a hard thing alone and has just encountered someone else who has been doing the same. "You need a lawyer," he said. "I need a lawyer in this county, which is complicated because the 2 lawyers in Silver Creek both have existing relationships with Hale family interests." She met his eyes. "I need someone to ride to Pueblo and engage the attorney I already consulted. I need that done in the next 10 days before the formal rent notice becomes legally actionable." "I'll go," he said. "Ethan, I know the road. I can make Pueblo in 2 days riding hard and be back in 5 with everything you need." He said it the way he said most things, without drama, without waiting for an argument to form. You need to keep working and not give Margaret Hale any reason to move faster than she already is. I can cover the distance. She looked at him across the workbench, this scarred, quiet mountain man who had walked into her shop 4 days ago with destroyed boots and bled on her floor and somehow become the only person in Silver Creek who was currently standing between her and the loss of everything she had built. "Why?" she said. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. "Because what's being done to you isn't right. And because I have the means to address it and no good reason not to." A pause. "And because the best boots I've ever worn are on my feet right now, and the woman who made them deserves better than this." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she reached back into the box and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This goes directly to Thomas Aldrich. His office is on Commerce Street, 2 blocks from the assay office. Don't give it to anyone else." She slid the envelope across the workbench. "Tell him Hannah Cole said it's time." He took the envelope and tucked it into his coat. "I'll leave in the morning." He was gone before she could say anything else, moving through the door with the purposeful quiet of a man who had decided a thing and would now simply do it. She stood at the workbench and breathed and tried not to examine too closely the feeling that had settled in her chest when he said she deserved better, the way it had landed on her, like something she hadn't known she was waiting to hear. She picked up her awl and got back to work. She had 12 cavalry boots and a legal battle to finish. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Rose Bennett had been passing the shop at the exact moment Ethan walked out, and that Rose had watched him tuck something into his coat with the focused expression of a man on a mission, and that Rose had walked directly to Margaret's office and described what she had seen in enough detail to make Margaret Hale set down her pen for the second time that week and think very carefully. "He's helping her," Rose said. "This is more than a boot repair, Margaret." "Obviously." Margaret's voice was clipped. "The question is, what she's given him to carry." "What do you mean?" "Ethan Walker doesn't run errands for people he met 4 days ago without a reason." Margaret stood and went to the window. "She's given him something. A document, a letter, something with legal weight. I can feel it." Her jaw tightened. "I need to know what's in that building before a lawyer does." Rose stared at her. "You can't break into her." "I'm not breaking into anything." Margaret turned from the window. "I'm going to pay Hannah Cole a visit, a neighborly one, and I'm going to offer her a settlement." Rose blinked. "You're going to back down?" "I'm going to buy time." The distinction in Margaret's voice was razor thin. "There is a difference." She came to the shop the following morning while Ethan was still on the road to Pueblo and Hannah was alone. Hannah heard the door and looked up and felt the temperature of the room change in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Margaret Hale had never once come to the East End in the 6 years Hannah had been operating. She came in now with a composed expression and expensive shoes, and the particular posture of a woman who was performing generosity. And Hannah recognized the performance because she had spent her life watching people perform things at her. "Miss Cole," Margaret said, "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot." Hannah set down her tool. She waited. "I wanted to come by personally and tell you that the rent increase was perhaps premature." Margaret came to the counter with a smile that almost reached her eyes. "I've been reviewing the East End properties, and I think there's room for a more reasonable arrangement." "I see," Hannah said. "I'd like to sit down and discuss a revised figure, something that works for both of us." A pause. "Without involving outside parties." There it was. Hannah heard it as clearly as a struck anvil, the confirmation that Margaret knew Ethan was carrying something, that she was here to neutralize it before it reached legal hands, that the sudden generosity was a door being held open just long enough to see what was behind it. "I appreciate you coming by," Hannah said. Her voice was level. Her hands were flat on the workbench. "I'll need to think about it." Margaret's smile held. "Of course. But I'd want to resolve this quickly for both our sakes, before any complications arise." "I understand your urgency," Hannah said. and she held Margaret's gaze just long enough to let the words carry every layer of meaning they contained and watched Margaret hear all of them. Margaret left. Hannah turned back to her work, and her heart was hammering, and she breathed through it steadily and did not let her hands shake. 3 days passed. On the morning of the 4th day, Corporal Tate came back. He came in with a different expression this time, something between official apology and personal relief. He had a document in his hand, and he set it on the counter with the care of a man who understood its value. The contract officer reviewed the complaint. He said, "We found no basis for the concerns raised. Your contract is reinstated in full, Miss Cole. The next delivery proceeds as scheduled." He paused. "I want you to know the complaint was withdrawn this morning. Someone contacted the depot before we'd even finalized the review." Hannah looked at him. "Withdrawn by whom?" The name on the withdrawal was Hale. She kept her face still. "Thank you, Corporal." He left, and she stood alone in her shop with that information, and she understood exactly what had happened. Margaret had withdrawn the Army complaint because someone, Margaret herself, or someone acting for her, had gotten word that the document Ethan was carrying might change the property ownership question entirely. The attack on the contract was a weapon being put away before it could be turned around. It meant Margaret was scared, and it meant Ethan was close. He rode back into Silver Creek on the 5th morning, exactly when he had said he would, with Thomas Aldrich beside him, on a gray horse, a lean, angular man in his 50s, with a lawyer's eyes and the road-worn expression of someone who had ridden hard and considered it worth doing. Ethan came straight to the shop. Aldrich tied his horse and followed. Hannah had the box on the counter when they arrived. She and Aldrich spent 2 hours at the workbench going through documents, while Ethan sat in the customer chair and said nothing. She watched him from across the room when Aldrich wasn't watching her, this man who had ridden 4 days over rough Colorado terrain in November, because a woman he'd known less than 2 weeks asked him to. He sat with his hat on his knee and his eyes on the floor, and he looked patient and certain in a way that had nothing to do with the outcome of the documents, and everything to do with the kind of person he was. Aldrich finally looked up from the co-ownership agreement and said, "Miss Cole, this is legitimate. With proper filing, you are a co-owner of record on 3 East End properties. Margaret Hale cannot raise your rent, cannot issue an eviction notice, cannot make any material changes to the lease arrangement without your legal agreement." "How long will filing take?" she said. "I'll ride to the county seat tomorrow. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. He looked at the document. "She may contest it. Let her contest it," Hannah said. And her voice was so quiet and so certain that Aldrich looked up at her with the expression of a man recalibrating what he thought he was dealing with. Ethan looked up from the floor and across the room at her, and what was in his face right then was not complicated. It was just respect, clean and absolute, with nothing attached to it, no agenda, no qualification, no condition. She met his eyes and held them for a moment. Then she looked back at Aldrich. "What else do I need to sign?" Outside on the main street of Silver Creek, the day was moving forward, the way days do, oblivious, ordinary, full of people going about their business without any idea that the quiet woman in the East End leather shop had just laid the first piece of a foundation that was going to change the shape of everything. Inside the shop, Hannah Cole signed her name to a legal document with a steady hand and no hesitation. She had not wanted a fight, but she had been ready for one for 6 years, and the difference she was beginning to understand was that she had never before had anyone willing to stand beside her while she fought it. Thomas Aldrich rode out of Silver Creek the next morning before sunrise, and the filing was done within 10 days, faster than either of them had expected, because the county land recorder turned out to be a meticulous man who recognized a legitimate co-ownership document when it was placed in front of him, and had no interest in the social politics of Silver Creek. Hannah received the official confirmation on a Thursday afternoon, slipped into an envelope that Aldrich sent by courier from the county seat. She read it once, set it on the workbench, went back to stitching. She didn't tell anyone, not yet. But Silver Creek was a town where information moved faster than weather, and by Friday morning, the county recorder's office had talked to someone, and that someone had talked to someone else. And by Friday afternoon, Margaret Hale knew. Hannah was aware of this. The way she was aware of most things, not because anyone told her, but because the texture of the town changed around her. Men who had walked past her shop for 6 years without looking up now glanced at the sign when they passed. Clara Garrett, the boarding house owner who had sent Ethan to her, stopped in for the first time in a year to place an order for a set of harness repairs and stayed 20 minutes longer than the order required. Even Tom Briggs, the merchant from Callaway's who had laughed about her situation within Ethan's hearing, crossed to the East End and stood outside her window for a moment, before deciding apparently that he didn't have a good enough reason to go in. The town was recalibrating. She could feel it. What she could not feel, what she refused to let herself anticipate, was what Margaret Hale was going to do next. She found out on Saturday morning. Margaret did not come alone this time. She came with her property manager, a pinched man named Aldous Ferry, who carried a leather satchel and the expression of someone paid to be present at unpleasant events, and she came with Rose Bennett, who seemed to have been brought along as a witness or a prop. Hannah wasn't sure which. They came at 9 in the morning when the shop was open and Hannah was alone, and Margaret walked in with the composed expression she wore like armor and set both hands on the counter. "I've seen the filing," she said. "Good morning, Margaret," Hannah said without stopping work. "You could have told me about the co-ownership agreement 3 years ago." "I could have." Hannah set down the leather she was working. "I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted to work." Margaret's jaw moved slightly. "You let me operate under a misapprehension about my own property holdings. You operated under an assumption you never bothered to verify." Hannah kept her voice level. "I didn't correct it because I didn't think it would ever matter. I was wrong about that." Rose made a small sound from near the door, something between a scoff and an exhale. Hannah looked at her. Rose looked away. "What is it you want?" Margaret said. "A renegotiation of the lease terms, a formal acknowledgement of the co-ownership. Tell me what will resolve this cleanly." "Nothing needs to be resolved," Hannah said. "The filing has established the legal reality. Your property manager can confirm the implications. But in plain terms, you cannot change my rent, you cannot issue a vacancy notice, and you cannot make any material decisions about those East End properties without my agreement." She paused. "That's not a negotiating position. That's the law." Ferry opened his mouth and then closed it again. Margaret looked at Hannah across the counter with an expression that was doing a great deal of work, holding back fury, holding back humiliation, holding back the very specific anger of a woman who had built her power on knowing more than the people around her and had just discovered a gap she had never seen coming. "You planned this," she said. "You've been sitting on that document for 6 years waiting." "I've been working for 6 years," Hannah said. "There's a difference." The door opened behind Margaret and Ferry and Rose. All 4 of them turned. Ethan Walker stepped in. He looked at the room, read it in the instant it took him to close the door, and moved to stand beside the workbench without a word. Not in front of Hannah. Beside her. The distinction was not subtle, and nobody in the room missed it. Margaret looked at him. Something fractured in her composure, not enough to show to a casual observer, but Hannah saw it. "This doesn't concern you, Ethan. Then I won't need to say anything," he said. Margaret held his gaze for 3 long seconds. Then she looked back at Hannah, and what was in her face now was not the calculating intelligence Hannah had grown to expect. It was something rawer than that. Something that might in a different woman under different circumstances have been close to genuine emotion. "I underestimated you," she said, and the words came out flat and honest in a way that sounded like they cost her. "Most people do," Hannah said. "It's all right." Margaret turned and walked out. Ferry followed with his satchel pressed to his side. Rose paused at the door and looked back at Hannah with an expression that was complicated, embarrassed, and something else. Something that might have been reluctant recognition. And then she left too, and the door closed, and the shop was quiet again. Ethan let out a slow breath. "You handled that," he said. "She'll come back in some form," Hannah said, reaching for her tool. "She's not done." "No," he agreed. "But she's different now." People who've been comfortable being cruel need to see it come at a cost before they stop. He leaned against the workbench. You just made it cost her something. Hannah looked at him sideways. You came by to check. I came by because I wanted to see how you were. She stopped working. That was a thing he had started doing in the past week, asking how she was not as a social formality, but as a genuine inquiry, the way you'd ask about the structural integrity of something you'd invested care in. It still caught her off guard every time, the directness of it. Most people either ignored her entirely or performed concern at her in a way that was about them. Ethan just asked. I'm angry, she said honestly, and I'm tired, and I'm fine. That's a lot to carry at once. It's what there is to carry. She met his eyes. How are you? He looked faintly surprised, as if the question turned back on him was still something he hadn't quite learned to expect. Restless, he said. Winter's coming, and I've been in town longer than I planned. You should go back to the mountains, she said. You've done what you came down to do. The boots, you mean? The boots, she said. And there was something in her voice that acknowledged everything they were both choosing not to say directly. He didn't go back to the mountains. He stayed another week, and then another, and Silver Creek began to adjust to the sight of Ethan Walker walking the East End street in the late afternoons and sitting in the chair inside Cole Leather Works while Hannah worked. He didn't help. He wasn't a leather man, and he knew enough to know where his competence ended. He just sat. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. He had opinions about territorial politics and trail conditions and the behavior of elk at elevation that she found genuinely interesting, and she had opinions about construction and materials, science, and the systemic failures of property law that he listened to with the focused attention of a man who was not accustomed to finding other people interesting, but was finding this one consistently so. The town noticed. The town always noticed. What the town mostly did with the information, to Hannah's mild surprise, was talk. Not cruelly, not the way they used to, but with a speculative uncertainty that was almost more interesting to observe. She heard some of it through Clara Garrett, who stopped in regularly now and had a gift for useful gossip delivered without malice. Men were reportedly asking Calloway why Walker was still in town. Women were reportedly asking each other what Hannah Cole had that they didn't, which was a question Hannah would have found funny if it hadn't carried the faint sting of being voiced as a genuine mystery. What no one was saying openly, what was happening instead in the sideways language of a small town that had decided to revise its position on something without admitting it. Had a previous one, was that people were starting to treat her differently. The hardware supplier who had been slow with her orders for years suddenly had better availability. The woman at the post office, who had always been just barely this side of rude, found a warmer register. 3 new customers came to the East End inside of 2 weeks, one of them a rancher from outside town who had heard apparently that Cole Leather Works did work the Army trusted. She did not fool herself that this had nothing to do with Ethan. She understood social mechanics well enough to know that the town's recalibration was partly about who had chosen to stand beside her and what that signaled. But she also knew in the private, unflinching way she knew most things, that the document in that wooden box had been real before Ethan arrived, and that the work on those cavalry boots had been exemplary before anyone in Silver Creek cared to look, and that the power she had demonstrated in that room with Margaret Hale had come entirely from inside herself. Ethan had not given her anything she hadn't already possessed. He had simply been present while she used it. That distinction mattered to her. She wasn't sure she could have explained why to anyone who hadn't spent years being told that they needed something external, a husband, a patron, a sponsor, to validate what they already were. She had never believed it, but she had absorbed the pressure of the belief, the way you absorb cold, without agreeing with it, but aware of it all the time. Having someone stand beside her without trying to own what was standing there was something she had not known she was missing until she had it. On a Wednesday evening, 11 days after Margaret's visit to the shop, Hannah was closing up when Ethan came back. She heard him knock. He had started knocking, she noticed, instead of just opening the door, and she said, "Come in," And he did. And he had his hat in his hand, which usually meant something was on his mind that he was working up to. She kept tidying the workbench. She gave him time. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right." He turned the hat in his hands once. "I had a wife, 8 years ago. She died in the first winter after we were married, fever quick and bad, nothing to be done about it. We'd been together 18 months. A pause. I went up into the mountains after that, and I stayed. Because it was easier than being around people who thought they knew what I needed, and because I didn't actually need anything, I just needed to survive the grief, and the mountains were good for that." She had stopped tidying. She stood at the workbench with her hands still and listened. "I came down every year or so for supplies and trade, and went back up every time, because there was nothing down here that made me want to stay." He looked up from the hat. "I want you to know that. Because I don't want you to think that what's been happening these past weeks is ordinary for me. It isn't. None of this is." She looked at him across the workbench. The lamp was burning low, and the shop was quiet, and he was the most straightforward man she had ever encountered, and the thing in her chest right now was something she had put away so completely she'd almost forgotten its shape. "I know it isn't," she said quietly. "I'm not a man who spends 3 weeks in a town he doesn't like for no reason. I know that too." She held his gaze. "Ethan, I need to tell you something as well." He waited. "I have been invisible in this town for 6 years. Not the kind of invisible that comes from being quiet or staying out of trouble. The kind that comes from being a particular type of woman, in a particular type of place, where certain people have decided before you open your mouth what you are worth and what you are not." She kept her voice steady, but there was something underneath it now, something that had been pressed down under 6 years of purposeful stillness. "I am not going to pretend that doesn't matter to me. It does. It has always mattered. I just refuse to let it stop me." "It should never have happened," he said. "No, it shouldn't." She took a breath. "And I'm telling you because I need you to understand what it means that you see me. Not what you imagine. I am not what's convenient for you to actually see me. The work and the anger and the documents in the box, and the fact that I have been running a legal strategy in my head for 3 years because I always knew this day might come." She paused. "That woman is who you're sitting beside every afternoon. I need you to know her clearly before anything else happens." The silence lasted long enough to be real. Then Ethan said, "I know her. I've been watching her work for 3 weeks." His voice was quiet and completely certain. "She's the most capable person in this county, and I'm not saying that to be kind." Hannah breathed. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm still talking to you." He almost smiled. She almost smiled back. And the thing between them in that quiet lamplit shop was not romance exactly. Not yet, but it was something more durable than romance. It was the specific warmth of two people who have recognized each other accurately and found the recognition mutual. The door opened. They both turned. It was Clara Garrett, flushed and moving fast, and one look at her face told Hannah that whatever she was carrying was not good. "Hannah?" Clara came in and pushed the door closed behind her. "I just came from the post office. There's talk, and it's more than talk. There's a paper being circulated on Main Street. Someone has filed a contest to the co-ownership document with the county. Filed this afternoon express rider to the county seat." Hannah went still. "On what grounds?" "Forgery." Clara's voice dropped. "They're claiming the document is forged, that your father's signature on the co-ownership agreement was put there after his death." The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Hannah felt every implication of it spread outward in concentric circles. What a forgery claim would do to the legal filing, what it would do to the Army contract, what it would do to everything she had built. A forgery claim didn't need to succeed to cause damage. It just needed to exist long enough to create doubt, and in a county where Margaret Hale had relationships, and Hannah Cole had a 6-year reputation for invisibility, doubt was a corrosive and patient weapon. Who filed it? Ethan said, his voice dropping to something very quiet. Clara hesitated. "The name on the filing is Ferry. Aldous Ferry. Margaret's property manager. Ethan turned to look at Hannah. She was standing at the workbench with both hands flat on the surface, and her face was controlled in the way that faces are controlled when something enormous is being held behind them. "Hannah," he said. "I heard her," she said. "I'm thinking." She was thinking about the wooden box, about every document in it, about the one thing she had never shown Thomas Aldrich because she hadn't needed to. Hadn't thought she would ever need to. She crossed to the shelf where the box was kept and opened it and went through the contents with quick, certain hands. She pulled out a single folded paper and held it in the lamplight. It was a letter. Dated March 1878, 3 years before her father's death. Written in Douglas Hale's own hand, addressed to Gerald Cole, discussing the co-ownership arrangement in detail and referencing the agreement document by its exact date and terms. A letter that could only have been written if both the arrangement and the document existed at that time. A letter that made a post-death forgery claim mathematically impossible. She turned and held it out. Ethan looked at it, then at her. "You had this the whole time," he said. "I had everything I needed the whole time," she said. And her voice was not triumphant. It was just tired and true. "I just needed someone to force me to use it." She folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket, and looked at Clara. "I need you to get a message to Thomas Aldrich tonight. Tell him Hannah Cole has a response to the forgery filing, and he should come back to Silver Creek as soon as he can ride." Clara nodded and was out the door in seconds. Hannah looked at Ethan. "It ends this week," she said. He looked back at her with that steady, certain expression she had come to understand was his version of everything is going to be all right, delivered without the words because he was not a man who said things he wasn't sure of. "I know it does," he said. Thomas Aldrich arrived in Silver Creek 2 days later, riding harder than a man his age probably should have, and he came directly to the shop without stopping at the boarding house first. Hannah had the letter from Douglas Hale on the workbench when he walked in, and she slid it across to him without preamble, and she watched his face as he read it. His expression went through several stages: professional assessment, recognition, something that looked very close to relief. "This was written 3 years before the co-ownership agreement was signed," he said. 2 years and 8 months before," Hannah said. Hale references the arrangement as something they had already discussed verbally and intended to formalize, which means the document didn't create the agreement, it recorded one that already existed. A forgery claim requires proving the signature was added after death. Aldrich set the letter down carefully. "With this, you can prove the arrangement predates the document, which means there was nothing to forge. The document simply captured what was already real." He looked at her over the paper. "Miss Cole, why did you not send this with the original filing?" "Because I didn't think it would be necessary," she said. "I miscalculated how far she would push." "Well?" He folded the letter with the same care he'd given the co-ownership agreement. "She pushed too far. This doesn't just defeat the forgery claim, it demonstrates that the claim was made without legitimate basis, which opens a separate legal question about the motivation behind filing it." Ethan, who had been in the customer chair since Aldrich arrived, said, "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning that filing a fraudulent contest to a legitimate land document is itself actionable." Aldrich picked up his pen. "Depending on what we can demonstrate about intent, Aldous Ferry, and potentially the person who instructed him to file could be facing a legal response of their own." The room was quiet for a moment. Hannah said, "I don't want to destroy her." Both men looked at her. "I want it to stop," she said. "I want to work. I want the contract secure and the property rights established, and I want to be left alone to do what I do." She held Aldrich's gaze. "If there's a path that accomplishes that without a prolonged court fight, I'd rather take it." Aldrich studied her for a long moment. "I can draft a letter to Ferry and to Mrs. Hale laying out what we have. The implication will be clear that we have the capacity to pursue them legally, but are choosing at this time not to." A pause. "That kind of letter tends to end things." "Draft it," Hannah said. He drafted it at her workbench while she sewed, and Ethan sat quietly, and the afternoon moved around them. When it was done, Aldrich read it aloud, and it was exactly what it needed to be. Precise, restrained, and carrying beneath its professional language the unmistakable weight of a loaded weapon being deliberately set aside. "I'll deliver it personally," Aldrich said. "This afternoon." He left with the letter, and both supporting documents, and the expression of a man who had ridden 2 days and found it worthwhile. Hannah went back to stitching. Ethan stayed. "You could have gone further," he said after a while. "I know. She earned worse than what you gave her. Probably." Hannah pulled a stitch tight and moved to the next. "But I'm not interested in what she earned. I'm interested in what I want to build." She glanced at him. "Burning things down takes the same energy as building them. I'd rather build." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking about what you said the other night, about being invisible." She kept working. "I was invisible too," he said. "Different reasons, different shape of it. But after my wife died, I made myself invisible on purpose. Went up into the mountains and stopped being a person other people could reach." A pause. "I told myself it was grief, and it was for the first year or two. After that, it was just habit. It was easier to be nobody to everyone than to risk being somebody to one person and lose that again." She set down her work. She turned on the stool and looked at him directly. He met her eyes. "I stopped being invisible when I walked into this shop," he said. "I didn't plan to. I don't think I even knew it was happening until I was already 3 days down the road to Pueblo thinking about whether you were all right." She said nothing for a moment. The lamp held steady between them. "That scared you," she said, not a question. "Terrified me," he said without any trace of embarrassment. "Still does some." "Good," she said. "It should. That means it's real." He almost smiled. She turned back to her work, and her hands were not shaking, which she considered a significant personal achievement given that her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. Aldrich's letter reached Margaret Hale's office at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Hannah knew this because Clara Garrett sent word at 4:30 that Margaret's property manager had been seen leaving the Hale offices with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who had just been told to solve a problem he had created. At 5 o'clock, Clara sent word again. Ferry had gone to the telegraph office. At 5:45, Aldrich came back to the shop. Ferry withdrew the forgery filing within the hour, he said, setting his hat on the counter. "I also received a written acknowledgement from Mrs. Hale, accepting the co-ownership determination and committing to no further challenges to the East End property arrangements." He slid a single page across the workbench. "Signed and witnessed." Hannah picked it up and read it. Every line of it. She read it the way she read contracts, completely, with attention to every word and the spaces between them. When she finished, she set it down and looked at the signature at the bottom. Margaret Hale's handwriting was, she noticed, very controlled. Even in defeat, it looked like a performance of composure. "Is it binding?" she said. "As binding as a written acknowledgement can be without a court order. Combined with the filed co-ownership record, yes, this is effectively concluded." Aldrich took the document back and tucked it into his satchel. "I'll file the acknowledgement with the county as supporting documentation. After that, any future challenge would have to contend with both the original record and the voluntary acknowledgement." He left within the hour this time without the urgency. He'd arrived with a different kind of ride, slower, satisfied. Hannah stood at the workbench and held the quiet of the shop around her like something physical. It was over. 6 years of working in silence and absorbing the weight of being unseen and keeping a wooden box of documents under a shelf, because she had learned very young that the truth needed to be preserved carefully, or the people with power would simply replace it with a different story. 6 years of being the woman no one looked at the shop. No one talked about the person Silver Creek had collectively decided was not worth the attention. All of it over. Not because the town had changed, she had no illusions about that, but because she had forced the legal reality of her situation into the light and made it impossible to ignore. She was still standing there when Ethan came back in from where he had stepped outside to give Aldrich his goodbyes. He took one look at her face and said, "You all right?" I don't know yet, she said honestly. I think I've been bracing for a fight for so long that I'm not sure what to do with the absence of it. Rest, he said simply. That's what you do with it. She looked at him. He looked back. And the thing between them that had been building for 3 weeks with the quiet patience of a foundation, being laid stone by stone without announcement, was suddenly present in the room in a way that didn't allow for looking past it. You came down for boots, she said. I got boots, he said. You should have gone back to the mountains 2 weeks ago. I should have, he agreed. I didn't. She held his gaze. Why not? And I want the real answer. Not the one that sounds reasonable. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive thinking. She appreciated that about him. He didn't answer before he knew what he wanted to say. Because for the first time in 8 years, going back to the mountains felt like leaving something instead of going home to something. He said it plainly, without decoration. I didn't know how to account for that, so I stayed until I figured it out. And have you, she said. Figured it out. Getting there. She almost smiled. He almost smiled back. And the almost was enough for now because neither of them were people who rushed toward things they wanted to keep. 3 days later, Margaret Hale crossed to the East End for the first time in her life that wasn't tactical. Hannah saw her coming through the window and felt her jaw tighten instinctively, and then she watched Margaret walk past the shop without stopping. Continue to the end of the street and stand there for a moment looking at the 3 buildings she could no longer make decisions about alone. Then Margaret turned and walked back, and this time she stopped at the door of Cole Leatherworks, and she came in and she stood at the counter and Hannah waited. I need a pair of gloves, Margaret said. Riding gloves. Good ones. Hannah looked at her for a long moment. Deerskin or elk? Whichever holds up better. Elk, Hannah said. Come back Thursday. Margaret nodded. She turned to go, and then she stopped, and she turned back. And what was on her face now was the closest thing to honesty Hannah had seen from her, all the performance stripped away. Just a woman in her late 40s who had reached for a weapon and found it pointing back at her. Your father was a fair man, she said quietly. My husband spoke of him that way. I should have asked more questions about that arrangement when Douglas died. I didn't, and I assumed, and... She stopped. Started again. I shouldn't have gone after the army contract. That was too far. Hannah held her gaze. Yes, she said. It was. The word landed without cruelty and without forgiveness, either just fact, and Margaret heard all of it. She left without saying anything else. Hannah stood at the bench and breathed and thought about what it cost a woman like Margaret Hale to walk through that door and say those words, and found that she could hold space for how much it cost without it changing what had been done, and without it meaning that everything was resolved. Some things ended without being resolved. That was all right. She could live with all right. Ethan came by in the late afternoon, and she told him about Margaret's visit. He listened, and didn't try to interpret it for her, which she appreciated. You going to make the gloves? He said. I said I would. He nodded. That's who you are. It was a simple thing to say. It hit her somewhere deep and real, the way simple true things do. A week passed. Then another. November deepened and the cold settled in seriously, and Hannah finished the cavalry boot order and delivered it and received payment and deposited it, and the numbers in her account were solid for the first time in 3 months. And she sat with that for a while and let it feel like what it was, a foundation. Rose Bennett came to the East End on a cold Thursday morning and stood outside the shop for a long time before coming in. Hannah watched her through the window, saw the deliberation, the straightening of her shoulders, the decision being made. Rose came in, and Hannah gave her the same waiting quiet she gave everyone. I owe you an apology, Rose said, and it came out slightly strangled, like a thing being pulled out rather than offered. I said things about you, to Margaret and to other people, things that were unkind, and I didn't know you. I was making assumptions based on... She stopped. Based on nothing real. Hannah studied her. Rose Bennett was genuinely uncomfortable, which was different from Margaret's composed reckoning. This was messier, less controlled, more human. Thank you for saying so, Hannah said. That's it. Rose blinked. What else would you like? Rose opened her mouth and closed it. I thought you'd be angrier. I was angry, Hannah said. I did my work. The anger burned off. She tilted her head slightly. Is there something you needed made? Rose laughed, a short, surprised sound, real and slightly helpless. A bag, for traveling. Good leather, proper stitching. Come back Monday. Rose left and she was shaking her head in a way that looked like someone recalibrating a fundamental belief about how the world worked. Hannah turned back to the bench. She heard the shop door open again immediately and turned, expecting Rose had forgotten something. It was Ethan. He had his hat in his hand, which meant what it always meant. You have something on your mind, she said. I do. He came to the workbench and didn't lean on it the way he usually did. He stood straight and looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was simply how he operated. No sideways approach, no preamble designed to soften a thing before it landed. Winter's here. I need to go back to the mountains. She felt it, a compression in her chest, clean and honest. I know. I've got a line in the high Rockies that'll run all season. Good territory, better than last year. I can work it through March. He held her gaze. But I want to come back in spring, and I want to know before I go whether coming back means something or whether it doesn't. She looked at him across the workbench. The lamp between them, the shop around them. 6 years of silence and 3 weeks of being seen, and one mountain man who had walked into her life on broken boots and stayed long past the point his boots were fixed. What would it mean to you? She said carefully. If it meant something. It would mean I'm coming back to a partner, he said. Not a sentiment, not a convenience. A partner. Someone who runs her operation and knows her own mind and doesn't need me to rescue her from anything, because she doesn't need rescuing, and I'm smart enough to know it. He paused. Someone I can sit beside while she works, and not feel like I need to be anywhere else. She breathed in slowly. And in the mountains. In the mountains, a partner who can decide whether that life suits her or whether it doesn't. Honestly. Not because she feels obligated to the man who rode to Pueblo. He held her gaze. I need a real answer, Hannah. Not a kind one. She was quiet for a moment. She let herself think genuinely, think, not perform thinking. She thought about the shop and the contract and the box of documents and everything she had built here in 6 years of invisibility. She thought about the wooden chair by the door and the way this man sat in it without needing her to perform anything for him. She thought about the letter from Douglas Hale that she had carried for 6 years, like a weapon she never wanted to use, and about the man standing in front of her who had ridden 4 days without being asked to. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a beat. Yes, to which part? To the partner, she said. To the spring. To finding out whether the mountains suit me. A pause. I've run this shop for 6 years and I've earned every inch of it, and I'm not walking away from it. But I'm also not going to tell you I need you to stay when what you need is to go, because I don't operate that way. You go work your line. Come back in March. She held his gaze with the same steady clarity she brought to every piece of work that mattered to her. I'll be here. Something shifted in his face. Something that had been held careful and quiet for a very long time released its grip and let him look like a man who had not expected this much and was deeply glad to have been wrong. I'll be back in March, he said. He left the next morning before sunrise. Hannah did not go to the street to watch him go. She lit the lamp in the shop and settled on her stool and picked up the work in front of her and began. She thought about her father, who had shaken hands with Douglas Hale on a piece of land without knowing what his daughter would one day need it to be. She thought about 6 years of silence that had not been weakness, but strategy, patience worn over ambition, like a glove worn over a hand. The hand still there, still capable, waiting for the moment to matter. She thought about a man shaped by survival and a woman shaped by the same thing, finding each other in a leather workshop on the forgotten end of a Colorado town, and what it meant that neither of them had needed to become someone different in order to be seen. Winter settled over Silver Creek, and the shop stayed busy, and Hannah Cole worked as she had always worked, with complete attention and total silence, and the kind of sureness that comes from a person who has looked at everything that tried to diminish her and decided every single time to be larger than it. March came as it always did, smelling of thaw and possibility, and on a Tuesday morning in the first week of it, the door of Cole Leather Works opened, and Ethan Walker stepped in, with new furs on his mules and worn boots on his feet, and a look on his face that said he had spent a winter in the mountains thinking about exactly one thing and had come to exactly one conclusion. She looked up from the bench. She looked at his boots. "Those need work," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." And in the quiet of that shop in that Colorado spring, with a legal document filed and an army contract secure and a town that had learned the hard way what it had been overlooking for 6 years, Hannah Cole set down her awl and stood up from her stool and walked to the customer chair and held out her hand. And Ethan Walker sat down, and for the first time since anyone in Silver Creek could remember, neither of them was alone. They built a life on the only foundation that ever holds. Not beauty, not wealth, not the approval of people who had never taken the trouble to look, but the bedrock of two people who had seen each other clearly in the worst of circumstances and chosen to stay. That was enough. That was everything. That was the whole truth of it.